Hello everyone, أهلا وسهلا. Welcome to part 3 of the Geophysical Tricks while FTP executing playlist, and it's the part 2 for the Arabic playlist. On the previous parts, we have mentioned the some of the geophysical challenges, plus the depth conversion workflows and approaches as well. Today on this session we are going to cover some other topics related to the geophysical activities during FDB running. First slide displays main approaches, main geophysical approaches. Two approaches are quite important for any geophysicist. I'm talking about the middle phase, after the acquisitioning, after the processing, after depth conversion. Plenty of tasks has been accomplished, done already, and now we approaches the interpretation. So main geophysical approaches for the interpretation. Interpretation here goes for horizon interpretation and fault interpretation. So first, fault interpretation. Second, horizon interpretation. So what are the features of the fault interpretation? The geophysicist going to interpret the faults on 2D lines as displayed here. So that put on his shoulder a major responsibility in order to interpret correctly on 2D lines. That fault which has been interpreted on that line, the same fault on another 2D line, or is it different? So at that stage, the geophysicist must work jointly with the geologist in order to avoid any misleading or any exaggeration could happen. What about the fault interpretation on 3D cubes? As displayed here, the mission a little bit more easier, still not easy enough, but much easier to interpret faults on 3D cube rather than interpret faults on 2D separated lines. Okay, what else? That fault defined for different places or the same, as displayed here. That's one of the main challenges as well for the any geophysicist. Give different names for different faults, but after moving forward or backward, or change from inline and cross line into arbitrary lines, maybe they missed naming the correct fault on the right place. So these adding another responsibility on the shoulder of the geophysicist. What about smoothing that faults which has been interpreted looks like smoothed or looks like displayed here a little bit it's not smooth, it's actually ugly interpreted, but maybe need fine-tuning, need more enhancement, some editing. In order to avoid as well, is that the same fault or is it another fault has been crossed or maybe truncated from middle or from top or maybe from bottom. So that's very important point as well, to smooth that fault in order to come up with a correct structure of the for the area setting. Those aspects of the fault interpretation. What about the horizon interpretation? When it comes to the horizon interpretation, now we can find, okay, that reflectors, that amplitude, is it rigid? Is it smoothly continued? What about the increment? I must select in order to come up with, to keep a normal resolution, to come up with a good interpreted for the horizons. So the increment itself of the spacing between the inlines or cross line in case of I'm running the interpretation on 3D cube. So now we can understand we got many approaches for any geophysicist during his interpretation phase for on the faults and on the horizons. Okay. What about the different interpretation techniques? Some geophysicists combine the interpretation of the faults and the horizons. So whenever he finds any break in continuity, so he put that fault, draw the fault, and continue interpreting the horizon. Sometimes they are interpreting 2 or 3 horizons at the same time. Sometimes they started with just only the faults first in order to understand maybe the trend of the structure of the area, then jump to horizon interpretation. So we got different techniques here, and it's all based on the geophysicist's choice. So it's his or her choice to pick whatever technique she or he feel comfortable with. So there is no rule or must law to follow in such case. So different techniques, you are free to apply whatever you want of these techniques. As we can see here on the left image, that one with A and B for the hanging wall and foot wall, we can see the spacing here very, very narrow. So that means the increment itself of the inline and the cross line is very maybe not exceeded 20 meters maybe. So that it means it's very intensive interpretation for the lines. What else? The window itself, in order to keep a very good resolution, some geophysicists would like to focus, so they are narrowing the window of the interpretation in order to focus on the reflector itself. Some other geophysicists choose another way, another technique of the interpretation through zooming out in order to capture the whole reflectors, the whole section, to see everything. It does affect on the resolution for sure, but it's another kind of technique for the interpretation. What else? Another technique, third technique. It's sort of kind of structure restoration by using the fancy of any tool or software through flattening seafloor, for example, or another shallow reflector for shale, for example, in order to come up with sort of structure restoration, in order to understand more about the area setting. It's another technique, so it's not obligatory for anyone, but it's your choice by the end of the day. What else? What about while interpreting the horizons? To extrapolate a little bit the interpretation, the points, the peaks itself, after the amplitude, after the reflector, and later on define that through the fault polygon, drawing fault polygon and erase in between. Just to try to a little bit reduce the uncertainty of the interpretation as much as the geophysicist can. Sometimes as well, using another technique through confirming that if he starts with the inline, so move to the cross line in order to confirm the interpretation. And later on, start with interpreting the faults. So we got different techniques while interpreting the faults or horizons, maybe together, maybe every one standalone interpreted, faults interpreted standalone, horizon interpreted standalone, or combined together, or some horizons interpreted with each other, some faults tracked to interpreted together or not. So different techniques based on another many factors, based on the geophysicist himself or herself, based on the structure setting of the area itself, if the area highly dissected with the faults or it's a little bit smoothly, the structure doesn't affect the area much. So by the end of the day, it depends on your choice as a geophysicist. Okay, After the interpretation, whatever techniques has been chosen has been applied, the mission accomplished, faults had been interpreted at the correct place, the fault has given name, and the horizon has been interpreted smoothly, no rigid surfaces, smooth, and this is the last result. Horizon interpreted and false interpreted as well. Lovely. What the next step after the interpretation? Now it's depth map. With the previous videos we have mentioned that the difference between the time cube and depth cube. Most of the geophysicists preferred to start interpreting on time domain cubes or 2D lines rather than starting interpreting on depth, because the structure is a little bit more clearer and easy to determine on time domain rather than on depth domain. But if they are afraid of converting and we got already the depth cube, so it's okay. However, maybe the reflector is a little bit shows more flattening than on time domain. But anyway, interpretation accomplished, the mission moved okay onto the stage. Then let's move for mapping, depth map. We come up with two main aspects of the contouring. While mapping the interpretation horizons or zones, we come up with the first feature, the first aspect is interpolations. Some holes, maybe small holes or a little bit big holes, appeared. That because there is sort of uncertainty while interpreting at some areas, at some locations. So it's based on the algorithm of the contouring that helps to interpolate these areas or these places. The interpolation as well affects the closures. So sometimes it does change the structure closure or the prospect of the area. Maybe yes, maybe not. Maybe it does affect, maybe it doesn't. Change the shape of the closure from 4-way closure to maybe 3-way closure, because the interpolation maybe a little bit make it elongated or different shape. So the geophysicist must be ready for such kind of maybe issues raising up during the interpolation, or maybe not. Extrapolation. The extrapolation is the second aspect while contouring. While mapping, on the previous slide, it has mentioned that the geophysicist using the fault polygons to clear the fault heave, to eliminate and to erase interpretation, also to come up with a correct estimation for the displacement between the hanging wall and the foot wall. So the extrapolation affecting positively or negatively on the fault plane, and maybe adding volumes along the fault planes if the extrapolation exceeded the intersection points between the horizon interpretation and the fault itself, the fault points, so that might add some volume or might not. If the erased by using the fault polygon, if the geophysicist erased, deleted more interpreted horizons in order to increase the fault heave, so this maybe as well affect negatively on the volume, so it's decreased the volume. So the extrapolation may play a main role for the volume calculation or estimations by increasing or decreasing. So this is very important as well point raised here for the geophysicist while during contouring mapping. What else? Here, as we can see on both, a fault heave a little bit wider, on the right hand side fault heave a little bit narrowing. So which is correct? On the right hand side we can expect more volume, on the right hand side we can expect less volume. So extrapolation playing with the fault plane and fault heave. Interpolation plays with the closure itself. May it change the shape of the closure from four-way closure to three-way closure, from three-way closure maybe to elongated closure, or some different forms. What else do you expect while mapping your depth surfaces? Last thing here of the mapping, I call it fine-tuning. On the software they call it smoothing. Smooth the map itself, smooth the contour map. Smoothing, step number 2 of contouring of mapping after the interpolation and the extrapolation steps. Because the smoothing here, the fine-tuning and the smoothing affects on the 4D modeling, affecting the engineering disciplines, the petroleum and reservoir disciplines, engineering disciplines here, because they are keen to run a correct 4D dynamic model in order to match the history of the production of the field. I mean, for simulation purposes, the reservoir and petroleum engineers, they are keen to come up with a very smooth maps, depth map, but with highly considered the well tie, because in case of the geophysicist smoothed 2 or 3 times his map or her map, so come up with the minimum mismatch, mistie. Let's imagine just only 2 meters and a half, just only 2 meters and a half mistie between the horizon, smoothed contour horizons, and the well tops or the formation tops. That amount, that value of the mismatch or miswell tie doesn't appear on any contour maps. Doesn't appear, just only 2 meters and a half. However, for the simulation purposes, that might affect if we are talking about, for example, a thin beds, a thin laminates of the reservoir, or the base itself for the intercalated clastic reservoirs. So these value of the mismatch might affect on the corrections or on the shape of the cells itself, and cause very wrong and plenty of mistakes when the reservoir engineer goes to allocate or to match the perforation interval versus these maps or on the reservoir for the bay. So the fine-tuning here or the smoothing is quite important to be run within limit and avoid causing any sort of miswell tie. Also to keep the structure as it is without any deformation for the cells itself. So we like to keep the cells itself in a very good shape, very cubic shape, in cubic form, and to tie the formation tops to come up with a correct allocation for the perforation intervals and the base as well. So as you can see on that last map here on the cursor, as we can see, this red closure displayed here on the big map versus that fold. So when it comes to the modeling, so the interpolation and the extrapolation and the smoothing, all these steps does affect on the closures, the fault planes, and the cell deformations or shapes. On next video we are going to continue with the 3D and 4D modeling and what is the requirements during mapping to come up with the correct map that help to come up with a very successful structure 4D modeling, for example, or maybe 3D modeling at the early stage before running the simulation. So, next videos, I'm going to discuss and show the different algorithms of the mapping and the trials and the interpolation and extrapolation first, then the smoothing effect. I hope you find this interesting for today, and please keep well and stay safe. Bye.